Hi everyone, and welcome to this 10th episode of the NERPS webinar series on the peace and sustainability nexus in the context of global change. I am Ayub Sharifi, an associate professor at Hiroshima University, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. If this is your first time joining our webinar, the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, NERPS, is an international network of educators, researchers, and practitioners collaborating towards the advancement of peaceful and sustainable societies amidst global challenges. We started this webinar series last year and will culminate with the NERPS conference on peace and sustainability that is scheduled for March 1 to 3 next year. And the call for proposals for this event will soon be announced. We would like to invite all of you to consider joining us in person in Hiroshima next year. So the theme of today's webinar is Earth System Governance for Sustainable Development and Peace. And we are very much honored to have Professor Frank Biermann from Utrecht University with us today. I would like to invite our Director, Professor Shinji Kaneko, for some welcome remarks, and he will also introduce our speaker, Professor Biermann.
So good evening in Japan, and good morning in Netherlands, and then hello to the rest of the world. It is our great pleasure to have this 10th NERPS webinar today. For those who have joined us in the previous webinar, thank you, and then welcome again. We envision this initiative to serve as a platform to encourage us to rethink and update our knowledge and practices surrounding peace and sustainability nexus, especially in this time of rapid global transformation. We invite leading experts to share their knowledge with us about the emerging topic on peace and sustainability, including sustainable development and ways to achieve the sustainable development goals. And it is indeed our great pleasure to welcome our special guest for this webinar today. And he is a research professor of global sustainability governance with the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Professor Frank Biermann. Our guest is known to many of us for pioneering Earth system governance paradigm and global change research and superheading the Earth System Governance Project, a leading global transdisciplinary research network of sustainability scholars. His work has greatly influenced our scholarship and practice on sustainability. For that, he received many recognitions, including being elected as Fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, a group of 700 individuals chosen for eminence in art, natural and social sciences, and the humanities. And more recently, he has been presented with the Distinguished Scholar Award by the Environmental Studies section of the International Studies Association. We are truly honored to have with us today a leading scholar of global institutions and organizations in the sustainability domain, Professor Frank Biermann. Please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can you see the slides? Everything is fine, good. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure participating in this webinar today. It would be fantastic to be also in Hiroshima and to meet all the colleagues in person. But I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you virtually. And I'm looking also very much forward to the conference that you have announced in March next year. And I wish you all the best in the preparations and hope, and I'm very sure it will be a fantastic event to set up your center and to further advance the study of sustainability and peace for our planet. And I talk a bit about this today, introducing the concept of Earth system governance in the context of sustainable development and also peace. I'm not a peace scholar per se, but I believe that also the planetary transformation that we are facing today has a lot to do with the preservation of peace on our planet. So I'm talking about all of this in a large overview in about 30 minutes. To start with the scope of the challenge, introduction of my talk, why are we talking about this? Why is it so important for our research, and why is it also has been the main part of my career for the last 25 years, is the change, the fundamental change on the planetary systems by which people have been so fundamentally influential on our planet that the entire planet has been reshaped by human activities. And this is something that you can see on this photo that is symbolizing the situation. This is United States from at night, where you see the tremendous impact of people on Earth. And I could produce the same photographs also, of course, of East Asia and any other region of the world. I'm very sure that Hiroshima would very much look similar from outer space today. So this is a challenge of the Anthropocene. To put it in very condensed terms, the global change communities, the geosciences and biosphere scientists, they have argued already 20 years ago that the entire Earth system has moved outside the range of natural variability that it had over the last 500,000 years, and that human activities could trigger severe consequences for the environment of the entire Earth, switching maybe even the Earth system to alternative modes of operation that may prove irreversible and less hospitable to humans. A big statement, already 20 years old, a statement that has motivated me and many of my colleagues to engage in this field from the perspective of political science, international law, sociology, and other social sciences. I believe that in this context of what has been called the Anthropocene, the epoch in planetary history that is dominated by human species, that in these times, politics cannot be business as usual anymore. They require a new type of governance, a new planetary vision for human cooperation, and also a new way of deep time thinking and a new type of belief of fundamental political critique. I do not want to hide that the Anthropocene concept is not an unproblematic concept. It has been criticized a lot, and I think it has been criticized rightfully so by many colleagues in the field who have argued that the Anthropocene presents what I sometimes call the one humankind paradigm, that we are all the same, we, the humans, we, humankind. And this is a picture of humankind as one big actor that hides oppression, it hides colonialism, it hides inequality, it hides capitalism, it hides issues of gender, and might also lead, as some colleagues have argued, to a vision of global technomanagerialism, in the sense that the vision of the Anthropocene might lead to geoengineering and these big eco-modernist, big tech approaches. And I share these criticisms, and many of us share. On the other hand, I believe there's not really any alternative. Many alternative terms have been presented, they have been argued for. I looked at many of the alternatives, and none was really convincing to me because they only zoomed in on a particular element of the big challenge without really embracing the entire scope of what we are facing. So therefore, I continue to use the term Anthropocene because I do not see any alternatives to really describe the planetary epoch that we have entered. But also, and this is very important, we have to use the term Anthropocene. We have to think the Anthropocene with a lot of critique and in a very nuanced understanding. This is very, very important. We cannot just say we as people, the big Anthropocene. We have to understand the inequalities and other types of oppression in the Anthropocene. So this means to me as a political scientist also that we have to revisit the concept, the notion, the idea of environmental policy. And I think we have to move from the old 1970s, 1960s, 1980s understanding of environmental policy in the 20th century that was at that time very important. We have to move forward to a new understanding of governance and politics in the Anthropocene and the planetary visioning process. And I have argued for this for 20 years. My most recent publication was half a year ago, published in the journal Environmental Politics, in which I argued that we have to advance a paradigm shift from environmental policy to new ways of thinking in the Anthropocene. And in this paper, which is open access, can be downloaded free of charge at any time. In this paper, I argue that we have to revisit this environmental policy paradigm because it falls short. In this paper, I argued on 5 grounds. I believe that the concept emphasizes a dichotomy of humans and nature that is no longer defensible, because in the Anthropocene, we do not really have nature or an environment out there around the human person, the human species, that is untouched and unharmed, and to some extent also unmanaged by people. This old idea that there are people and there's some nature out there or some environment out there is absolutely outdated and obsolete. We are talking today about integrated systems where people and non-human species and non-human elements are all intertwined in social ecological systems at local scale, at regional scale, and surely also at planetary scale. This is very, very important. I also believe that the environmental policy paradigm has de-emphasized in the past 20, 30, 40 years questions which are very important, questions of justice and questions of democracy. I do not deny, of course, that we had a long tradition of environmental justice and ecological democracy, but I believe that in the mainstream discourse, the mainstream environmental policy conferences, mainstream environmental journals, mainstream environmental debates, that here issues of justice have been neglected to some extent, and certainly they have been overshadowed by debates on effectiveness. Environmental policy has always been largely about effectiveness and never really sufficiently on justice. And I think this is a very important shortcoming. We have to rethink this in directions of planetary justice. I also believe that some of the important normative challenges of the Anthropocene, where humans are in all their inequalities and differences, humans are steering the planet in certain ways. We are a very, very important, maybe the most important factor on the planet. This raises new normative challenges, and I come back to them. I believe these normative challenges cannot be addressed by environmental policy paradigm. And also, and I think here I'm speaking a bit also to your concern in Hiroshima and your colleagues about peace, that I think the Anthropocene raises also important questions of your survival, in a way, of people, the survival of non-human species. And you can frame these issues very much of questions of peace and justice, but also of peace very much. And I think that the environmental policy paradigm has marginalized these concerns, and we need new debates. And I'm very happy that you in Hiroshima, at the University of Hiroshima, that you are now engaging in this debate and you try to bring together the planet, the concerns of peace, maybe also elements of justice, and to bring it all together in your city that is so well known for research in this area on peace. I think that's a very great initiative. I'm very much welcoming you for taking this important initiative at your university. Let me talk about the next step in my story, which is about Earth system governance. So I believe environmental policy is not doing it. So therefore, I have, together with many colleagues, developed about 15 years ago the idea of Earth system governance as a new idea, a new paradigm to understand governance and social systems in the Anthropocene. I believe that Earth system governance is, we propose Earth system governance as a new paradigm in the social sciences to better understand politics and times of social ecological system changes, as I mentioned, at planetary scale. I believe that Earth system governance as a paradigm radically breaks with traditional notions of environmental policy by replacing these old dichotomies of human nature and human environment that I mentioned with a social ecological systems perspective, and also, and this is very important to me, an explicit focus on planetary interdependence and planetary justice. The focus of Earth system governance is, of course, the steering of societal behavior of political actors. It is not about steering the planet. Sometimes there's this misunderstanding that we want to kind of steer the planet. It's not, nobody wants to manage the Earth as such. This is totally impossible, of course, but it is about steering societal actors, political actors in Japan and worldwide to a direction of a more sustainable world in the Anthropocene. So this is what Earth system governance is in a nutshell. It is a multi-level exercise. It is a multi-level challenge. It's not only about global institutions, even though I believe, and I will talk about this, that global institutions are important and that we have to reform the United Nations fundamentally, but Earth system governance is also a local activity. Most action actually lies at the local level. It lies in daily struggles, in conflicts in cities, villages, regions, and nation states. So I think the city of Hiroshima is an important actor in Earth system governance, as all other cities and villages are. But what is different in Earth system governance is the vision, the understanding of a planetary interdependence, a perspective of social ecological systems at planetary level, and also a concern of interdependence in a way of justice. That what you are doing in your own city, in your own village, in your own country can only be understood in the context of global dependence and also justice with all other humans and maybe even non-human species. So that's, I think, very important to point this out, that it's a multi-level challenge. And talking a bit more about planetary interdependence. So Earth system governance requires, I believe, very novel types of cooperation at the global level. So in a sense, if you see these two photos, the right is the planet as it is, the left is how the planet is organized by people. And 119 countries with borders, currencies, capitals, etc. And this is not the right way, I believe, to really organize our responses to the challenges of the Anthropocene. So I believe that we have to revisit the way how countries cooperate. We have to revisit the issues of sovereignty, but also in a sense of subsidiarity. So not everything has to be decided, of course, at the global level. But the question is, what is a decision for all together? What is a decision to be left at the local level? But certainly we need new types of cooperation in a planetary vision. And many actors have argued for a stronger system of Earth system governance. A number of international agencies have argued, as you see on these slides here, about strengthening Earth system governance, having more effective Earth system governance, overhauling the United Nations systems maybe. So there is a lot of support for these kind of ideas, but how to organize it is still very much a challenge. I have contributed to this in my research. This has really been a focus of much of my research, summarized largely also in a book that I published some years ago already, Earth System Governance, the World Politics in the Anthropocene, in which I have laid out a number of proposals that have also been laid out further in some academic articles in journals about anything from the United Nations Council for Sustainable Development. I think it's a very important part, new trusteeship council, new modes of voting, responses to climate refugee crisis, United Nations Environment Organization, etc., etc. I cannot go into detail here, but this is very important to my own personal research agenda to find new ways of global collaboration and the Anthropocene period. And one element of the entire challenge that I just want to put out here is that I believe that we have to engage in new debates on majority voting. So far, most environmental treaties at the global level, they are based on the idea of consensus. All countries have to agree. That means the least interested country can dominate the debate, that can dominate the decisions. And this, I think, is not leading to a more effective international governance system. So therefore, I believe we have to engage in more debates about majority voting. The question is how to do that. How do you organize majority voting? Is it one country, one vote that would give a huge dominance to tiny countries? Like Liechtenstein, Andorra, Luxembourg, Monaco, all are independent nations internationally. They would dominate the decisions. If you say one person, one vote, it will also give us huge dominance to the huge countries. And many small countries might not accept. So therefore, we need to have new ideas, hybrid modes of majority voting. I think this is a tremendously important research area that we have not sufficiently explored so far. I want to come now to the fourth part of my talk, which is about planetary justice, which I think is an important part of Earth system governance. To put it in very simple terms, we have the planet on the right, and on the left, we see how the wealth, the resources of the planet have been divided among human consumers. I mean, the use of humans of all the resources that our planet offers us is tremendously unequal. So you see the blue part on this graph, which shows 20% of human population are consuming 76% of the private consumption of our planet. And you see this little green sliver there, which is 20% of humankind that is using only 1.5% of the planetary resources. And this is, in my understanding, it's a normative question, but I believe this is tremendously unjust. This is the way how we have organized the planet. This is the way how the economic system functions. This is the way how the last hundreds of years of history have worked to an unequal system that is more unequal than any country on this planet is or probably has ever been. And I think this is tremendously unjust and has to be taken into account when we're discussing issues of Earth system governance. and maybe also issues of world peace, as you are discussing in Hiroshima, because this is a very important underlying factor when you want to discuss peace and sustainable development. And we know, of course, from recent reports that it has become even worse. It's not only 20%, it's to some extent even 8 people only that own as much as, to some of the courts, half of humanity. Or it's 1% of the human species that is owning as much as 2/3 of humanity. So there are kind of lots of these statistics that are coming forward. Oxfam is very busy in counting this. And my understanding of the last 5, 6, 7 years of reading the Oxfam reports are that it's actually getting worse every year. Every year there's a new report. It's kind of the concentration of wealth globally, but also in many countries has increased tremendously. And this is a big challenge also for Earth system governance. And we have to discuss this and we have to take it into account in our governance solutions. I believe that's very important in Earth system governance. I think it's an inherent part of Earth system governance to prioritize the poor. I have published a paper with colleagues, Prakash Kashwan as the lead author. We have published a paper just very recently in which we have argued that prioritizing the poor in planetary scale is an important, maybe the most important part in Earth system governance. And we have based us here on Mahatma Gandhi, who has written or said in his last years, the so-called Gandhi talisman, in which he said that whenever you have a decision to face, whenever something is important and you consider what are the options, what are the normative solutions, what should you do? Then Gandhi has said, then in this situation, recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man and woman whom you may have seen and ask yourself, if the state you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her, will he or her gain anything by it? Will it restore the control over his own or her own life and destiny? And this is what he argued is this important moral principle. I believe that's very much also for Earth system governance, that any solution that we are discussing, maybe also in the research program in Hiroshima, I think an important question should always be what's in for the poorest people on our planet. Maybe also poorest people in Japan, of course, to the extent they discuss local and regional solutions, but very much also what are the consequences for the poorest people on our planet, on any solution that is being discussed in terms of Earth system governance. And this leads me to my 5th part of my talk, which is about the goals that we have to set on planet Earth. And this is a very, very important consequence of the Anthropocene idea. Because Anthropocene means, as you recall in the beginning of my talk, that people are a fundamental, maybe the most dominant actor on the planet in all the inequalities. It's not humans as such, especially it is the wealthy, the powerful, the richest people. And that means that we also have now in these contexts, start to decide how we want to have our planet. It's a very, very strange situation. And people never had this before. Like 200 years ago or 300 years ago, people in Japan, they were just reacting to the environment. They were reacting, they were sitting there, they were farming rice, and they were reacting to the forces of nature, and they were always outside them. I mean, whatever, storms and bears and all kind of external factors. But right now, we really engage in debate about how we actually want to have our planet, like climate change. Do we want to have 1.5, 2 degrees, or implicitly go for more than 2-degree warming? So there's a debate where the Japanese government, together with European, African, American governments, are deciding a temperature target for the planet. And this is unprecedented, that the Japanese prime minister is traveling to faraway places and discusses a temperature target for the entire planet. But this is what happened in Paris, actually. So this is a new way of thinking about how do we want to have our planet. And it sounds a very hybrid kind of discussion, but it is not, because if we do not engage in this discussion, we also take a decision. So we can't be like the ostrich and just put the head on the ground in the sand. We have to engage in these discussions. And this is new for people and government and governance, and we have to engage into it. And there are lots of debates out there. There's one proposal, for example, that I put on the slide, is the idea of planetary boundaries. And I don't explain it because it's very, very widely known. I believe also among the participants is the idea that there are boundaries on our planet, like climate change, ozone, or chemical pollution. And then if we are transgressing the boundaries, then the planet will skip into a new state. And this will be a state that is not very hospitable for people. Has been extremely powerful as a visionary, this idea of planetary boundaries. And I also share a lot of the enthusiasm about this idea that scientists can identify these boundaries. But, and this is a but, I also have a lot of criticism. And the criticism is that there are some boundaries that are less obvious than others. I have no problem that scientists are defining a boundary on, let's say, stratospheric ozone depletion. It's a pretty purely scientific activity to some extent. On the other hand, I have lots of questions about boundaries for freshwater use, for land use, or other more social ecological systems, where I believe this is not left to be science. This should not be done by scientists and experts. This is a societal debate. How much land should be used, can we use, who's using land, who's using freshwater. So in a world that is so unequal, as I pointed out, it's not only about scientists to discuss these kind of issues at the planetary scale. So therefore, I had also a lot of criticism of the planetary boundaries, and I believe it needs to be seen much more in the context of global injustice and should be also organized in a way where scientists are much less dominant and people and government should be much more important. The 2-degree target I just mentioned is one example. There is no 2-degree threshold in the climate system. It's a human invention. I mean, there is, of course, some values and some risk values. It is somehow based on science, but to go for 2 degrees or for 350 parts per million, these targets are human targets. They're made by people, they're made by experts, and they're not inherently in the system. There are decisions by people. And I believe we have to take the decisions, but I also believe these decisions have essentially to be taken in a societal deliberation and not by experts. And right now, I think a lot of weight is put to the experts and not a lot of weight is put to other actors. I think this is a big, big problem. The Sustainable Development Goals that we study a lot in Utrecht, they are in a way an alternative vision because they have been negotiated by stakeholders and governments together. And they're also a way of organizing the normative space for humanity. And they have goals for the next years till 2030. They're supposed to be achieved. And they cover classical ecological issues such as life on land and life below water, but they also cover societal issues such as the eradication of poverty, the ending of hunger, and many others. So if people are interested, not familiar with the SDGs, you can easily Google them. There's huge websites about the SDGs. And I encourage everybody to engage with the SDGs and the many, many political programs around them. There's also, of course, SDG 16, Peace and Justice, which I'm sure will also be very much discussed in Hiroshima among the colleagues there. So this is another way of organizing the normative space in the Anthropocene. It's also not without problems. And we have studied this also in Utrecht, and we have a number of publications in which we are also pointing to the problems that come with the SDG agenda. So in a very, very fundamental, basic vision, one can say that this goal-setting process in the Anthropocene, that there are 3 different kind of directions or strategies. One is intergovernmentalism. That means that governments are deciding this. And this is a bit the approach in the United Nations settings, the Paris Agreement. That means governments are deciding this if they want to with legally binding force, and then it can really trickle down to national constitutional courts, to all kind of decisions. It has binding mandate. And here the idea is representation. The idea is that intergovernmentalism represents all countries of the world. It's not ideal, we know that, but it is the core idea of representation of people in a way that people are electing their governments, and therefore they take part in these decisions as representatives of the people. Pluralism, as I call it in this is on the slide, is more the idea of stakeholder representation. This is a little bit how the SDGs are. They are agreed upon by governments, but they had also a lot of stakeholder participation in the negotiations with NGOs, but also businesses being active there. And here the rationale is the representation of stakeholders through participation. And that's also an interesting way of setting goals. And the third one is what I call scientism, and this is more like the planetary boundaries, or also the Earth System Targets community, where the claim is to take these decisions by scientists. Originally, the planetary boundaries were very much based on just the natural scientists. Now the next phase seems to be the Earth System Targets, seems to be that also social scientists are stronger involved, but still the idea is that even social scientists are now deciding also what is just. And I believe these ideas about scientific decision-making on these levels are not the right way forward. I believe that we have to engage with people, with stakeholders, with governments, and not the scientific dominance that you find here. This is a little bit like Plato, good old Plato has described in his work, the way the Plato's Republic was, as some might know, has been written in a way that he says the philosophers should be the kings. So I mean, the scientists should be the kings and they should be the decision, and then everything is fine. I believe this is not the right way forward. We work a lot on the global goals. As you're interested, we have a research program there in Utrecht University, where we are studying global goals with a variety of methods. And if people are interested, just follow us on the globalgoalsproject.eu site or on Twitter. And we have webinars, we have a task force on the Earth System Governance Project. This is one research area which is very important to me personally, but also many other colleagues are working on this together. So if you're interested, just join us, send me an email later for those in the audience here. This is a really fascinating research area. And I come now to the last part of my talk. And this is a little bit extra for the peace part. Right? So it's kind of now, I don't really talk explicitly about peace because I hesitate to really link the issues of planetary transformation to threats to peace, because it sometimes goes immediately into a military direction. And I try to avoid this connotation because I think it's not necessarily proven that the outcome of the Anthropocene is necessarily a word of conflict and war, and the only solutions are generals. I do not believe that you argue this way, but I think that's, of course, one connotation that can easily be coming when you say climate change and peace, and then easily it goes down to the Pentagon. Could be, and not what you are doing. But I know from myself, when I go to conference, I always struck how many soldiers, generals, and military people are today at these kind of conferences. But I certainly believe also that, this Earth system transformation could result, if we don't get it wrong, in new states of the system that might have extreme effects of societies. I think this is one of the big challenges. If you really look very carefully at the natural science readings, then the outcome of many of these system changes, especially, of course, climate change, can be brutal for our societies. Not necessarily next year, not necessarily in 10 years, but in the long term, we might have a fundamentally different planet that the human species has never experienced so far. And there's no doubt that this is also a challenge for those who are concerned about peace. A slide I like to show to my international friends. This is, on the left side is what a colleague of mine has done in a late night drawing session, the Netherlands in 2300. And this is kind of, for those of you who know the Netherlands, it's kind of half of the country is gone actually. So, and for those who know the Netherlands, it's really a very funny thing. I'd like to discuss it with my students that our university will maybe be a little bit 50 years longer because we have these high-rise buildings and therefore we will form an island when everything else is underwater. Anyway, on the left side, you see these are the abandoned coastal defenses that say abandoned around 2100. Anyway, this is kind of, it's just the back of the envelope drawing, not by me, but by geoscientists. This is really people who really study this, some of the best people in the world. And they said this could be possible. And then on the right side, you see, of course, our secret adaptation program. Netherlands is fully prepared to climate change. So this is kind of, the dangers are certainly there. And this is not a joke only, it comes over funny, but in a sense, if we don't make the 2 degree or 1.5 target, this is probably inevitable at some point. So therefore, we need adaptation governance. I think very important. I think it's very important also for the peace research community at Hiroshima. I was very motivated by this quote, which is now already very old, by Bob Watson, a leading British-American scientist, who argued many, many years ago already that we should prepare for 4-degree warming. We should always politically go for 2 degrees, or today we would say for 1.5 degrees, but it's not a problem to maybe think about what kind of adaptation should be needed. I personally worked on climate migration and climate refugees. This was one line of research I set up 10 years ago, in which I studied political responses, possible political responses to protect climate refugees, or climate migrants, as they're called today, climate mobility. And this is one line which I built up, and I think it's still very important to think about the impacts of people and migration and their behavior. And their protection also. I was very much driven of protecting people who might be have to leave their places without having been responsible actually in any way for the causation of the problem, poor people especially. And the other thing, this is a new line of my research and also very much of my critique, is what I call the false answer of eco-modernism, which is solid geoengineering. These are those people who say, well, Mitigation is not really working sufficiently. Paris will not work. Adaptation is too expensive or too impossible. And therefore, some people say that we need to have some ways of fixing the problem artificially, for example, by reducing the radiation that we get from the sun, and therefore artificially cooling the planet. And the example that is being given is mimicking a volcano eruption. A volcano eruption, we know, at a certain size is cooling the planet, and people say we should do it. I have a lot of concerns about this, and I've written papers about it. I'm working together with an alliance of colleagues where we argue that this is the wrong way forward, and we should not go into this direction. And there are lots of arguments against the normalization of solar geoengineering as a tool, an instrument of climate change. If you're interested in these issues, talking for whoever is listening today, just send me an email, and I'm very happy to engage with you and bring you in touch with those people who are critical of solar geoengineering and try to block these technologies from becoming normalized. One reason is that the debate on geoengineering and these kind of issues is very much driven also by the global north. We did one study which was really an eye-opener to me, where we looked at all those publications and conferences and workshops in which these issues have been discussed. And you see on this one, we counted the speakers in very simple terms. We counted the speakers, and there were essentially only 3 countries talking about it. There were Americans, there were Brits, and there were Germans. Whereas Japan is also there a little bit, not that much. Good, anyway, so it's essentially 3 countries that are shaping this discourse. And these 3 countries is about 5 to 6% of the global population. It's a very tiny minority of people on the planet that talk about it. And I think they have no legitimacy and they should not talk about it. If we do it, we need to have a global debate from day one. And I believe it should be stopped anyway. So this is very important, that it should not be a rich man's toy or rich man's solution. And I think we should discuss this very critically. And this is now the very last part, is that also for the scientific researchers there, I think one consequence of all what I have said is that we need to have a new way of science. I'm not the first to argue it. There's a community out there, the sustainability science research community for 20 years already, where people argue that we have to go away from the photo that you see here, a German scientist 200 years ago in the old way. I mean, sitting there reading nice books in Latin and all kind of stuff in dusty rooms. And this is over in a way. This is now how we can deal with the Anthropocene. So we have to move from individual research to collaboration. We have to move from national research communities to an invisible global college. And I think webinars such as this in the English language can help a lot. To really build up a global research community on these issues. We have to become interdisciplinary and also transdisciplinary research community. That means that we have to engage with stakeholders. It's not scientists, philosophy professors should not be the kings. They should engage from day one in transdisciplinary research designs with stakeholders, which is a global stakeholder community, very important. And also we should probably think much more about the challenge-driven research. That means not only theory-driven, which is still important, but also very much organizing our research in a way, how can we address the key issues of the Anthropocene in the 21st century? I think that's the key for any research. And my understanding is from your group in Hiroshima is that you are very advanced in this direction. And in a sense, you want to do challenge-driven research. And your challenge is peace and stable development. I think that's a very, very important one. There are some, this is from Future Earth originally. Job knows this, of course, very much. This is a new idea of how science could be organized. And I think this is the right way to go, in the right direction to go, to think about a more integrated transdisciplinary approach. On the other hand, and this is also very important, and we have a research program on this as well, we have to see also these kinds of models in the light of global inequality and global injustice. So we have to understand also, and I do research on this with many of my colleagues at Utrecht, we have a program which we call the Decolonizing Sustainability Study Group at Utrecht University. We're just getting this together, in which we are studying very carefully, for example, the authorship in international journals, the editorial boards of international journals, conferences, steering committees, networks of citations, etc. So many quantitative data we try to assemble, and the finding is always the same. It is essentially an OECD-based research community. There's a huge dominance of some countries, always rich countries, quite often English-speaking countries. They are dominating the journals, they are dominating the debates, And many other countries have not any strong voice in these global debates. And I think this is a problem, and we have to actively work towards a decolonization process of our sustainability science programs. And that means to really actively think about how we can make our universities, especially in rich countries, more global universities that can address these issues in a participatory, global, and more equal way. I've done research on this for 20 years, a little bit on and off. It was not really always a center of my research. So my first papers have been already in the 1990s on North, South, and science. And I still continue this now, as I said, in a much more focused way with colleagues together in the Decolonizing Sustainability program at Utrecht University. And again, to those who participate in this webinar and listen in, I'm very keen to work with others. So if you're interested in decolonizing sustainability, in particular decolonizing sustainability science, please email me and get in touch. And it would be great to work together with you if you're interested in these important issues. And the last slide now is a call for an invitation. For those who are listening, I really much invite you also, if you're interested in these issues of Earth system governance, Anthropocene, the planet, peace, justice, all these issues, and join the Earth System Governance Project. It's a global pluralistic community of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and engaged scholars worldwide. We have about 500 researchers in the CLOSA network. We organize conferences every year. We have a global alliance of 17 research centers. And 500 is just those who are really on the website with full engagement. Our conferences and webinars reach many more people. We have 4 publication outlets. We have 1 book series with MIT Press. We have 2 book series with Cambridge University Press, a big one and a small one. We have our own open access journal, Earth System Governance. Open access, again, is very important because anybody can download any article free of charge worldwide, which is very important to make it a global journal, where also people without access to elite universities can download any article at all time, also people outside universities. So therefore, it's open access, free of charge, no copyrights, no paywalls. So if you're interested, just join. And the same is for all of this. You can just send me an email or follow us on Twitter and get in touch. My final slide, always show these days for the last couple of years, is a quote from Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, who said, I think this is really the call to action for our generation. I mean, no matter whether you are a senior professor or a younger student, it's all our generation, it's our time, it's our epoch. So we are the first generation, I believe, that we really have the means in many ways to end poverty. And we are also the last generation, unfortunately, or fortunately, that last generation that can take the steps needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And here with the adoption of these SDGs and the new development agenda and the climate change agreement of Paris, we can all work together to set the course for a better future. And I'm very happy to be here today on the webinar with all of you. Many of you from Japan, I understand, and maybe from Hiroshima University. I'm looking forward to learning more from your own work in Hiroshima, especially with your particular niche of peace and sustainable development. I'm looking forward to learning more, engaging more with all of you, and especially your center. And I'm also looking forward to hear more about the important conference that's being set up in March next year in Hiroshima. And I very much hope that the pandemic that is kind of harming us all, the pandemic will be sufficiently over. It will probably never be fully over, but sufficiently over that you can have a successful and engaging conference in March next year. Thank you so much. And I hope that you stay in touch. You can email me, you can follow us on Twitter, my website, and I'm looking very much forward to hear more from you also now in the chats. Thank you so much for listening in. And I stop the slideshow now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Biermann. This was a really informative talk. I'm sure all the participants have enjoyed your talk. I personally learned a lot. I've been following your work, of course, for a long time because of my engagement with Future Earth. And I truly know how Earth system governance has been contributing to the discourses of the Future Earth, and you've always been one of the most successful core projects of the Future Earth, trying to streamline these important issues about Earth system governance, but the shift that we need to make from having focus on effectiveness to also include the issues of climate justice and and also to facilitate the collaboration between different scholars and also practitioners across the world. So thank you very much for all your efforts, and I would like to congratulate you on these achievements. So to all our participants, thanks once again for joining us. Now we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. I can see that we already have a few questions. So if you have more questions, so please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box and also the chat box. And also, if you would like to raise your questions directly, I can enable your microphone. And please just also make sure to mention your affiliation as much as possible. So the first question is from Nir Reshev. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. The question is that, do you think nation states and the rise of right-wing populism is coming in the way of effective Earth system governance, or is it possible to govern globally with strong national narratives?
When I heard the first part of your question, my answer was yes. So certainly, I mean, the national right-wing movements that you mentioned have, of course, they're multifaceted. I mean, they're not only nationalist, they're quite often anti-environmentalist, up to the point of denialist. I mean, most of the movements that Neil, I think it was, has in mind are, of course, movement that totally deny the entire challenge. So it's not only nationalism, it is also some proto or whatever fascism it is, in whatever country you look at. And it's certainly also denial of climate. We have, like the Netherlands, we have unfortunately a relatively strong right-wing movement and then two parties, and they don't believe in climate change. That's how it starts. So these movements are obviously extremely harmful to the extent that they win elections or that they are able to drive the discourse in certain directions. And there's no doubt that this is a big challenge. We have on this issue actually a research program at Utrecht University that is led by Dr. James Patterson, is funded by the European Research Council. And this project is called Backlash. It has just started. The staff has just been hired. So they have not really started to work, but they will start working very soon after the summer. And they are studying these kind of backlash movements against climate change and other issues. So this is number one. And number two is, well, nation states, if they are not necessarily, if they're not denying the climate change program, but accepting it, I think, of course, they are powerful actors. Now, I think in the end, if countries are convinced of the challenges of the Anthropocene, and if countries also accept issues and principles of global justice, then I think nation states are very important in resolving the issues. I very much believe in the power of states and believe also in the past, I mean, that some of the most important changes have been enacted actually by governments. So therefore, I think it's a very important strategy also for the social movements to engage, of course, in elections and these kind of activities, to get into the state apparatus and to turn states into the right directions by setting taxation, regulation, and many of the other policy measures. I think they are very important and influential. Yeah, still it's a huge debate. So to Neil, I would say, if you're interested, just join us in our debates at Utrecht and in Backlash. That's kind of one of the most important research areas today.
Thank you very much, Professor Biermann. The next question is from Kian Cheng. First, it's a comment on science-based policymaking versus local stakeholders-driven approach. I would argue that we need both rather than opting for either of the two, as we already see constraints on science policy linkages when the scientific community is drawing final messages for policymakers, for example, under IPCC, and on air pollution debates in Northeast Asia. So his question is how to make such science to policy processes more robust, like speaking to the urgency of the issues concerned, and also leveraging political action.
Thank you so much. It's a very, very important question. Number one, I would not say that it's either or. I think I fully agree with the question as it has been framed, that it's not either science or stakeholders or governments, which means also that purely science autonomous activities, I think, should not be the right way forward. And I would make a distinction here on the terms of issues also. There are certain issues, I mentioned ozone depletion, which are pretty much, they're not that socially debatable in many ways, but there are many other issues, such as the use of water, the use of food, the use of land, and many other issues where I believe that the politics of the scientific assessments are much more dominant. And in these processes, we should not leave it only to scientists, but from day one, we should engage in a co-design of scientific knowledge creation that is not left only to scientists. I want to emphasize this is especially the case when you talk about the planet. I mean, goals or scientific assessments at the planetary level, because the scientific community is a community of northern people, essentially. I mean, not only, of course, but it is very much a community that is dominated in many ways by scientists of only very few countries. And we have to organize. We can't just leave discussions to a few scientists from a few elite universities in the United States that are setting the debate. We have to have a global debate. And that means also that science should not be left alone in deciding issues of food, water, land, and many of these other issues. I think that's very important. So science should be integrated into a societal debate process. It's one actor, but not the only one.
Great, thank you, Professor Biermann. There is also another very interesting question from Daniel Alvarez from the University of Tokyo. So he's asking, do you think the development of continental power grids as a favorable move towards sustainability in terms of having more renewables, creation of a transnational public good, or are you against it further to citizens?
Well, thank you so much. It's a very important question. I'm not an expert on what exactly is meant here in terms of continental power grids. What I believe is that, I mean, we have to move into the direction of which fossil fuels are no longer used at all. And there, I believe that the long-range transmission of electricity is extremely important. So therefore, I would say that anything in this direction is an important contribution to the sustainability challenges. If the potential harms to people and nature have been sufficiently taken into account, of course. But generally, I believe that anything that can be done to move out of fossil fuels so fast and as quickly as possible is important. I think this should be one of the key concerns, that we get the complete decarbonization as soon as possible. I mean, targets have been set for 2050 in different countries and different targets. I believe this is important. I think many of these targets must be more ambitious. I believe that it's important to set short-term targets. So, I mean, like long-term targets can be always a bit dangerous for people to say, well, this is then beyond my lifetime or certainly beyond my office time. So short-term targets are important to initiate change right now. Decarbonization is key. And then long-range transmission of electricity and power, I think, is very, very important. I hope this answered this question. Otherwise, just email me if you have a more detailed discussion on these issues.
Thank you. The next question is from Taiwo Babalola from Pan-African University. His question is, what is the reality of the issue of peace and sustainability in developing countries? I believe he means like probably how feasible is it, or maybe if you have further clarifications, please let us know, Taiwo. And I can also enable your microphone. So, Professor Biermann, would you like to react to that?
I think there's no clear-cut answer. I mean, so developing world, if I understood the question correctly, is a very broad concept. I mean, there's some areas that make a lot of progress and other areas that, of course, have violent conflicts for decades. And this is the situation. So if the question is, what is the reality is mixed. It's terrible in some places. It's getting better in other places. From my side, from the Anthropocene, or especially like climate change debate, Earth system governance, it's very important, of course, to design these governance systems in ways that are minimizing violent conflicts. advancing peace. And I think here climate change is certainly important. I don't believe that necessarily climate change is increasing conflicts. That seems to be a bit more deterministic, pessimistic conclusion that you find sometimes in environmental literature. But certainly, I mean, it is a risk. So I think the Peace Research program at the center at Hiroshima is very important to address these issues. And for the colleague from the Pan-African University, I think it would be fantastic to have more engagement. I mean, it would be really great also to learn more from what has motivated this question. So I would really, because time is running, I understand. So would really encourage the questioner, the question to email me maybe, and we just maybe get in contact and we can really engage maybe in debate about these issues in a more extensive way.
Thank you. And we have two more questions. And I would like to ask the participants, if you have further questions, feel free to send them to us, and we will collect them and share them with Professor Biermann. So one question related to the previous one is from Samer Zidia here at Hiroshima University. He wants to know what is your perception to increase other countries' participation in this field, especially those countries that are non-English speaking?
Language is important. I mean, this is one thing that I think about a lot. There is a tremendous dominance of the English language. There's no doubt about it. One solution that many countries have adopted so far is just to speak English as we do right now. I mean, I know that, I mean, this was maybe also a question motivated from the Japanese context. And I know the Japanese, always struck when I am in Japan. I go to meetings in Japan, conferences and workshops. I'm always struck about the wealth of knowledge and experiences and fascinating research results I see, which I sometimes never heard before, because then in the end you learn, I mean, this has all been published in Japanese. So it's kind of course, sometimes sad that so much fascinating research is being done in Japan, but also in many other places like Latin America or China or Russia and many other places, which I'm not familiar with because they're not published in the English language. So the solution that the Netherlands have certainly taken, it's of course a tiny country in many ways, was already 10, 20 years ago to do everything in English. Like we have our bachelor programs in English, we have the master program in English, all our publications are in English, and the same is the case for Germany, for Scandinavia, for increasingly also, let's say France, for example. And I think this is one way forward. It has, of course, also many downsides, and we have to be very careful about this, to always see language biases in many of the findings. I mentioned one, which is university rankings, which I think are tremendously biased in favor of, based on language, for example, because it's based, for example, on citations, and that leads to those countries that exclusively publish in English and not in any other language anymore because they're just more cited. I mean, somebody who writes in Ireland is more likely to be cited than somebody who writes in Japan, for example. And this has nothing to do with equality. It's just that many people do not cite Japanese findings if they're not published in English. So I think language is very important. It is part of a post-colonial structures, I believe, also to some extent. So it has to be discussed very, very critically also. And solutions that we try to do is to simplify language, I think is very important. I mean, don't write complicated English. Don't be too stuck on the style of English. So in the Earth System Governance Journal, I mean, we write in English, it's an English language journal, but I definitely don't make a big fuss about the, I mean, it should be understandable, of course, and not totally wrong in a sense, but I don't say this is kind of not a native speaker, therefore we make problems. I mean, if I understand it correctly, I'm not a native speaker myself, this is all fine. So that's one important part. And the other one is, of course, to think about different languages. We have experimented with this at the Earth System Governance conferences. We had panels in Spanish, for example, at a conference we organized in Mexico. So I think this is also a way forward to also increase the use of other languages to the extent possible and appropriate, of course, in the context. It's a very important question, and look forward to have more insights also from the Japanese community on how you see these issues.
Thank you very much, Professor Biermann. I can see that people are really interested in the talk, and we have many questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. And I'm sure I completely agree with you that hopefully through this kind of activities, we will provide opportunities for also colleagues from the Global South to contribute in the discussions and also to make contributions towards addressing some of these very urgent and important goals. So I would like to once again thank you for your commitment and for your great contribution, for the very insightful talk. And I would like to also thank all the participants for joining us today and for your patience and for raising these very interesting questions. Before closing the session, once again, I would like to remind you that to keep the momentum, we will continue having webinars with prestigious and leading scholars in this field. And also next year from March 1 to 3rd, we will have the inaugural NERPS conference and peace and sustainability, that we will discuss peace issues, sustainability issues, and also provide a platform for people to talk about the nexus issues as well. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next webinars. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being there. Thank you so much, everybody. And please stay in touch.